The following program is a production of Truth for the World.
Ye servants of God, your Master proclaim, and publish abroad his wonderful name, the name all victorious of Jesus extol. His kingdom is glorious, he rules over all.
We are looking at the idea of Jesus as the Son of Man. And for our introduction, we're going to start with the book of John, chapter 1, and verse 43. The title, Son of Man, has often been used to mean the other side of the coin as opposed to the Son of God. In other words, if Son of God referred to the divinity of Jesus, then Son of Man must refer to his humanity. This view is not necessarily seen as totally correct by scholars today. And I've been guilty of stating it myself, but as we'll see, the Son of Man has a more complex, if you will, meaning than just the humanity of the Christ. But let's look at John chapter 1, reading in verse 43. The day following Jesus would go forth into Galilee, and findeth Philip, and saith unto him, Follow me. Now Philip was of Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. And Philip findeth Nathanael, and saith unto him, We have found him, of whom Moses in the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael said unto him, Can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? Philip saith unto him, Come and see. Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him, and saith of him, Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile. Nathanael saith unto him, Whence knowest thou me? Jesus answered and said unto him, Before that Philip called thee, when thou wast under the fig tree, I saw thee. Nathanael answered and saith unto him, Rabbi, thou art the Son of God, thou art the King of Israel. Jesus answered and said unto him, Because I said unto thee, I saw thee under the fig tree, believest thou? Thou shalt see greater things than these. And he saith unto him, Verily, verily, I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. Again, what did Jesus mean? Nathanael said, You're the Son of God. But Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man. As a matter of fact, it really may be, if I'm not mistaken, the most common phrase that Jesus used to refer to himself was Son of Man. But what does that mean? It means, I think, more than human, because Delbert Burkitt wrote this good question that I think expresses the idea well. If the expression meant son of the human, indicating descent from Mary or Joseph, why would Jesus so frequently emphasize he was born of a human when none of his hearers had any doubt of this? In other words, it would be like me going around saying, I'm the son of a man, I'm the son of a man. And you say, well, I never really had any doubt of that. Why do you keep emphasizing that? I know you're a human. I get it. Now, it's not to say that Jesus was not human. And it's not to say that the term Son of Man does not at least include in some way his humanity. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying he's not human or that the Son of Man doesn't refer to some degree in his humanity. But instead, the term may have a more complex meaning than we originally thought. And I think it possibly may turn out to be one of the best descriptions of the work of the Christ. So Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man, but what does he really mean? In this lesson, I want to look at Jesus as the Son of Man and do so in two parts. Number one, establish the usage of the term Son of Man to show that it is not a denial of deity. In other words, some people may say, well, Jesus is referring to himself as the Son of Man, so he's saying I'm not God. No, that's not necessarily true. Second, we want to examine the usage of the term in both the Old Testament and the New Testament to see what type of meanings that we get from the use of the phrase Son of Man. So first of all, while the exact meaning of the title, Son of Man, appears to change depending upon how it's used, the self-designated title Son of Man is not a term related exclusively to the humanity of Jesus, nor is it a denial of his deity. And I want to look at one instance over in the book of Mark to show that the Son of Man phrase is not a denial of deity. And this deals with the idea of the Son of Man at the right hand of God. In Mark chapter 14, let's notice verse 61. You may remember Jesus is on trial, if you want to call it a trial. Jesus was asked if he was the Christ, the Son of the Blessed, the Son of God. The high priest said, "Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And the response of Jesus uses the title Son of Man in a way that references him as a being of divine authority. And in an eschatological setting. If you remember, eschatology deals with the end of time. So let's look at what he says in verse 62. Jesus said, "I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." The idea of the Son of Man at the right hand of God is a being with divine authority. And coming in the clouds of heaven is the eschatological end of time reference. So Jesus says, you are going to see the Son of Man at the right hand of God and coming in the clouds of heaven. Now, Jesus may have been referencing the being described in the Old Testament in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 through 14. I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. That sounds kind of familiar from the New Testament, doesn't it? And Daniel refers to this being as the Son of Man. And when Jesus is asked, "Are you the Christ?" he says, "You're going to see the Son of Man at the right hand of God and coming in the clouds of heaven." This really may have been Jesus saying, "I am divine." Even though he's using that phrase, Son of Man, he's saying, I'm going to be at the right hand of God, and I'm going to come back as a judge of this world. And the claim to the divine was not lost on the hearers, because in Mark 14 again, you can see the reaction of the people when Jesus said this. The high priest rent his clothes and said, "What need we any further witnesses? Ye have heard the blasphemy." See, they got it. They got it. Yes, he used the phrase Son of Man, but he's actually referring to being divine. So, let's look at the usage. How many different ways can the Son of Man actually be used? To what does it refer? We want to start off by looking at the Old Testament. We already saw Daniel referencing the Son of Man. And if you recall from the verses we just looked at, the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, and also in the next verse, someone who has dominion, someone who's a king over a kingdom. And not just any kingdom, a kingdom that shall not be destroyed. So Daniel paints the picture of the Son of Man as the ruler over a kingdom. And the kingdom will have people from all nations. The book of Ezekiel in chapter 3 and verse 17. You may remember Ezekiel often we refer to it because God says, "I've set you up as a watchman over Israel." Son of man, I've made thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. What is he talking about? What are you supposed to do as a watchman over Israel? God says, hear the word at my mouth and give them warning from me. Son of man, you are a prophet. Isn't that what a prophet does? Takes the words of God and speaks them to the people. In this case, Ezekiel is being referred to as the Son of Man. In Ezekiel chapter 11 and verse 4 is another reference. Therefore prophesy against them. Prophesy, O Son of Man. Ezekiel is referred to as the Son of Man, a prophet. Well, the book of Psalm, chapter 8. You may remember these verses. What is man that thou art mindful of him? But notice the next part. And the Son of Man that thou dost care for him. Psalm 8 expresses the idea of the Son of Man as being made lower and given glory and honor. Notice the next verse in Psalm 8. Yet thou hast made him little less than God, and dost crown him with glory and honor. Different meanings in the Old Testament. What about in the New Testament? How do we see the Son of Man used in the New Testament? Well, it's seen in various contexts and in reference to different things, including someone who descends from heaven. In John chapter 3 and verse 13, no man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man which is in heaven. The Son of Man here is described as someone who was in heaven and descended down to earth from heaven. In Mark chapter 8, verse 31, the Son of Man is associated with suffering and resurrection. These are the words of Jesus himself. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and of the chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. According to Jesus, the Son of Man must suffer and be resurrected. Also in Mark chapter 9, just one chapter over, verse 9, you remember the transfiguration. But Jesus, when they came down from the mountain, he charged them, don't tell anyone what you've seen until when? Till the Son of Man is risen from the dead. Once again, the Son of Man must suffer and resurrect. The next chapter over, Mark 10, verse 33. Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be delivered unto the chief priests and unto the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death and shall deliver him to the Gentiles. Well, how is he going to suffer? What's going to happen? The Son of Man is also described in the New Testament as the one to be lifted up. The one to be lifted up. John chapter 3 and verse 14. In a comparison to Moses, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And in John chapter 8 and verse 28, then said Jesus unto them, when ye have lifted up the Son of Man, then ye shall know that I am he, and that I do nothing of myself, but as my Father hath taught me, I speak these things. He'll be lifted up on the cross. He will suffer, and in his death he will be glorified. The Son of Man is one to be glorified in his death. Take a look at a couple of verses from the book of John. Chapter 12 and verse 23 is the first one. When Jesus talked about the time when he was going to die, he referred to it sometimes as his hour. Mine hour is not yet come. But here he says the hour is come. And what's going to happen? The Son of Man is going to be glorified. And in John chapter 13, verse 31, therefore, when he was gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. The Son of Man is one who is to be lifted up and to be glorified in his death. But not only that, the Son of Man will have authority. Authority. Do you remember in Matthew chapter 9 when he's talking to the lame man? And he said, your sins are forgiven you. And everybody started going, what is this guy doing? He's claiming to be able to forgive sins. Only God can forgive sins. But notice what Jesus says, but that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. Shouldn't this also be seen as a reference to the divine? If only God can forgive sins, and Jesus says the Son of Man has power to forgive sins, then put two and two together. The Son of Man must be God. But he has power. He has authority. In Matthew chapter 12, he was getting in trouble, perhaps, for going through the fields on the Sabbath day, right? Do you remember that? I believe that's the instance we're talking about here. But the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath day. Sabbath was not made for man. Or, man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. Who made the Sabbath? God did. Who's Lord of the Sabbath? The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. In Acts chapter 7 and verse 56, when Stephen is being stoned, he looks up into heaven and he says, behold, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God. Not only in a position of authority, but it's interesting to note that usually we read the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of God. Or we read about the Christ seated at the right hand of God. Here we actually hear that the Son of Man is standing at the right hand of God. Now, I don't claim to know this for 100% sure, but from my understanding, the idea of standing may indicate a testimony. In some countries, including Great Britain at least, when witnesses testify in court, they're required to stand up. You stand up when you testify. And as Stephen is being stoned and killed, it's possible at least that Christ is standing up and saying, this one is one of mine. He's standing up, witnessing for Stephen. And Stephen says, the Son of Man is at the right hand of God, a power of divine authority. A place of divine authority. Not only that, but the Son of Man is described as one to, remember we said the Son of Man was someone to descend from heaven? The Son of Man is also described as one to ascend back to heaven. Look at John chapter 6 and verse 62. What, and if ye shall see the Son of Man ascend up, where he was before. He was in heaven, he descended, and now he's going to ascend back. The Son of Man is one to ascend, but he's not going to stay there necessarily all the time. The Son of Man is also the one to return. Matthew chapter 26 and verse 64. Jesus saith unto him, Thou hast said, nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Not only is the Son of Man to ascend, but he's coming back in the clouds. In Matthew chapter 24 and verse 30, Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. In Mark chapter 8 and verse 38, Whosoever therefore shall be ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him also shall the Son of Man be ashamed, when he cometh in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. The Son of Man is coming back. The Son of Man is coming back in glory. And in Mark chapter 13, verse 26, Then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. What is he going to do when he returns? What is he going to do at the end time, the eschaton, the time of the return of coming in the clouds in heaven? The Son of Man is going to be the future judge. The future judge. In John chapter 5 and verse 27, hath given him authority to execute judgment also, because he is the Son of Man. When the Son of Man returns in the clouds, he will execute judgment upon the world. As you can see, when we go through the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Son of Man can mean all sorts of different things depending on the context and its usage. It really may not be this one title that means just this one thing. It's very complex and comprehensive, and it's used in multiple different ways. Interpreters of the Bible have generally sorted the various uses of the title into three major categories. Number one, Jesus within the context of his earthly ministry. In other words, Jesus may refer to himself as the Son of Man in reference to his ministry, his work on the earth. But if you remember, he also described himself as the Son of Man who must suffer and die and be resurrected. So the Son of Man is also a reference to his humiliation, his sufferings upon the earth. And the Son of Man is the one who's coming again and will judge the world. That's generally what three categories interpreters have used. Norman Perrin actually suggested a fourth, and that is sayings concerning the exalted Son of Man. You remember like in Acts 7 when Stephen is dying and he looks up into heaven and he sees the Son of Man at the right hand of God? This is someone who's resurrected and is exalted and he's in power. If we want to add this fourth category, we might say that the sayings, as these men have said, the sayings portray Jesus as the earthly Son of Man, the suffering Son of Man, the exalted Son of Man, and the coming Son of Man. Let's go to our conclusions. Again, I want to quote Delbert Burkett and what he said. Early Christianity, in identifying Jesus of Nazareth as the Christ, developed a distinctive non-Jewish conception of the Messiah. In other words, this really may not have been what the Jews expected. We can see that in the New Testament. There's different ideas of what the Messiah will be. Some of it includes, are you going to overthrow Rome now and restore the king of Israel? It's like, no, that's not really what's going to happen. And in this conception, the Messiah, 1, had already appeared on the earth. 2, had been killed and raised from the dead. 3, he's ascended to heaven. And 4, he would come from heaven at the end time to exercise messianic functions. And when we look at the sayings that identify Jesus as the Son of Man, all 4 of those match him. The sayings identify, who are we talking about? Who are we talking about? The one who's already appeared on earth, the one who's killed and raised from the dead. It's Jesus. That's who we're talking about. The title thus appears to function as a general title for Jesus as the Christian Messiah. If this is the case, the distinctive associations of the different categories of sayings must come from the context, not from the title itself. The title seems to function in much the same way as Christ, as a title for the Christian Messiah that can refer to Jesus at any stage of his career, past, present, or future. In other words, we can't just say, the Son of Man just refers to the humanity of Jesus. It just seems to fall so short of all the complexity of what the Son of Man is really used for. It's this term that is used in so many different capacities for so many different things. It isn't a title that you can just say, well, this is what it means and that's all that it means. If we refer to the Son of Man and we try to in some way summarize all these things, if we really had to, I think we could come up with something like this. If we try to take all these nuances and sum them up, we might say the term Son of Man means the Messiah prophesied to come, descending from heaven, to suffer and be lifted up, to be glorified in his death, be given authority, ascend back to heaven, rule over an everlasting kingdom of people from all nations, and who will come again in power and glory to judge the world. That's what the Son of Man means. That's a mouthful. But in reality, if we look at the scriptures in Old and New Testament, it seems this is a pretty comprehensive definition of what the usage of the term Son of Man really means. And I pretty much tend to agree of what Oscar Cullmann wrote when he said, when referring to the title the Son of Man, it embraces the total work of Jesus as does almost no other idea. And if we think about it and go back in retrospect, and we may start to understand, maybe this is why Jesus referred to himself so much as the Son of Man. Really, maybe more than any other thing, he said, I'm the Son of Man, I'm the Son of Man. Well, that title comprehends so much about his work on the earth and what he had to do. It really may have been a very, very fitting title for him to use for himself.
If you would like a free Bible correspondence course, then write us at Truth for the World, P.O. Box 241, Bethel Springs, Tennessee, 38315, the United States of America. Or visit us online at truthfortheworld.org.
In a world where political, economic, and social instability seem to be the norm, how can anyone find happiness and peace of mind? Well, you begin by changing your focus from worldly things to those things that are from above. Paul said, I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 11. True contentment is obtained not by things of this world. Although Satan would like nothing more than for you to believe that you can only be happy when your political party is in power, when you're making more money than you're making now, and when your social status is better than it is presently. Christ said, But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. And what are the things that will be provided? Everything that you need to be content in this world.
If you would like a free Bible correspondence course, then write us at Truth for the World, or visit us online at truthfortheworld.org. Pop quiz. How many things can you do on the Truth for the World mobile app for Android, Apple, and Amazon devices? Well, there's watching TV programs, listening to radio programs, reading articles and tracts, listening to audio in other languages, reading the Bible, follow a Bible reading plan, follow a link to the Truth for the World website, follow a link to the Truth for the World YouTube channel, follow a link to the Truth for the World radio station. Phew, maybe you should just look at it for yourself. Download the Truth for the World mobile app for your Android, Apple, or Amazon device today. Learn the easy way with Truth for the World Bible College. Dozens of high-quality Bible education courses are available at truthfortheworld.education. Study on your own time and at your own pace. Certificates are awarded after every course. Plus, there's no enrollment fees, tuition, or charge for provided class materials. Why wait? Start your online study now and check back frequently for new courses.